Hi there, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Mr. Schwenk. Welcome to Cleo's Corner Geography. Today on Cleo's Corner, we are continuing our series on Africa by taking a look at the long history and important role that Africa has played for international trade throughout history. We established in our last episode on African geography that America, at least, has a complex history with the African continent. It's easy to fall back on misconceptions about the land and the people that live there. This is unfortunately due, in part at least, to the United States history of slavery and relations with African Americans, but it's also a function of African geography as well. The U.S. traces its history back to Britain and the rest of Europe, which in turn traces its history back to the Greeks and the Romans. This is what makes us part of what we call Western civilization. Those early civilizations traded with other parts of the world. They knew of Africa, but the Sahara Desert was an impossible barrier to cross for them. No one in Europe, at least, had much of an idea of what lay on the other side of that desert. By the time that the Portuguese and the Spanish had the sailing technology to explore sub-Saharan Africa, Europeans already had a firmly held idea or belief that anything not white and Christian was savage, uncivilized, and, most importantly, available for exploitation. So our misconceptions about Africa, the land, the people, and its history have been with us since the beginnings of our civilization, skewing our understanding of the continent and leading us to believe that Africa is sort of an undocumented place, a place where nobody really, it's very mysterious and in need of sort of taming. I'm thinking that native Africans might beg to differ, right? So keep this in mind as we unpack our essential question for today, which is, was Africa uncivilized? The big idea for today being that despite being not well known by Europeans, Africans had complex kingdoms and were, in fact, very involved in international trade and engaged with the rest of the world throughout history. It is well established at this point, kind of just to get a background, it's well established at this point that Africa is the place where we find the earliest evidence of human remains. Anthropologists, scientists have studied this, and the best information that we have is looking in places like the Olduvai Gorge in East Africa and really up and down the Great Rift Valley to find the earliest remains of humans, fossilized remains of humans. It's not often able in history that we can say that facts are set in stone, but in this case, it might be appropriate. In the mid 1970s, famed anthropologist Mary Leakey uncovered a layer of ash that had preserved animal tracks in it, kind of like walking through wet concrete. And that's all very interesting, but further excavation in 1978 found something truly astounding. They found a line of human footprints that were made when three individuals walked across the wet cement-like ash. The ash has been dated to 3.6 million years, and so we know that at least it shows that the humans were in Africa at this time, but also that they had developed bipedalism, or walking upright on two legs. Furthermore, the tracks point to several other important conclusions. First, the footprints show that these humans are walking with a modern heel strike, toe push off step. So when you take a step, you don't think about it because you're good at walking for the most part, but as you take a step, you land on your heel and you roll your weight forward and then push off with your big toe as you take another step. Second, and that's really important because, second, these prints show what we call an inline big toe. And I'll show you what I mean by that here in just a moment. You can see kind of like a footprint in the sand. You can see where the other toes are, and then you can see right here is where you would find that big toe, right? That's what we call an inline big toe, because it is in line with all of the other toes. That's different than, say, a great ape, where instead of having an inline big toe, they have what's called a divergent big toe. So our big toe is right here. That's theirs. It's not a thumb, but it kind of looks like it. It helps them to grasp things with their feet, climb trees, etc., etc. We don't have that anymore because we've developed that bipedal method of walking, right? So so we know that we are up walking around like modern humans by at least 3.6 million years ago. The third conclusion that we can look at points to something that scientists call sexual dimorphism, which is really just a fancy term for the idea that there are physical size differences between males and females within a species. So at Laetoli, one set of the footprints looks like a male, right? And the other looks like a female. You can even see from this image, you can see how you've got one set of footprints over here that are much deeper and larger than the second set of footprints alongside of it, right? Now, this also indicates what kinds of social groups that humans are keeping, or at least it points to it, right? There are not hundreds of prints, so we're not in a large group of people walking across this. This is just 3 people, right? It's also not, let's say, like one male print and lots of female prints. So it's kind of like a herd of animals. A lion pride, for example, has one male lion and lots of female lions. So instead you have very possibly the beginnings of something that looked like a modern nuclear monogamous family. But I mentioned 3 footprints, and you can only see in this image 2, and that's the most incredible part, is that the third footprint is actually significantly smaller, and it is a child or a juvenile's footprint. And the best part of all is that the prints are actually found inside the footprint of the larger male footprint. So what I'm trying to say here is, like, maybe you as a small child, have tried to walk in your parents' footprints on the beach or in the snow. And that's exactly what we're talking about. How cool is it that 3.6 million years ago, you can see this picture of a small family of humans walking along side by side, and the kids, being kids even back then, are entertaining themselves by hopping along, trying to walk in dad's bigger footprints, right? It's just truly and absolutely, an amazing, uh, uh, an amazing find, right? And so, and all of it points to the fact that we owe it to Africa um, for our existence at all, much less it being a savage and uncivilized place. So, skipping forward millions of years, literally, we've already learned about one of Africa's ancient civilizations, the Egyptians. We often group Egypt in with other Middle Eastern civilizations because that's who they interacted with. But it is an African civilization. It existed in Africa. Ancient Egyptians were Africans. We can also add the Empire of Carthage to the list. Now, you might not be as familiar with Carthage, but it was a major opponent of the Roman Empire before it was destroyed by Rome. Keep in mind, if you look at where these are, and Egypt doesn't quite follow it because it's following the Nile River. But keep in mind that both of these civilizations are existing on the north coast of Africa. People are living on that north coast, but they are interacting with Europe and the Middle East and what we would call the Mediterranean world. And so their civilization is a Mediterranean civilization, more so than what we would call sub-Saharan Africa, or the civilizations south of the Sahara, right? Um, what's happening, we still have this great barrier of the Saharan desert. And as far as Europeans are concerned, what's happening south of the Sahara is anyone's guess. But it's clearly populated and organized. Africans relied on oral history and stories that were passed down through generations. They did not create much in the way of written records. So we have a lot of gaps in the historical record. But we do have artifacts and we have language that we can study today as well. Africa has hundreds of languages that are spoken across the continent, but many of those languages are very similar to each other, and they could be grouped into three, or rather 6 to 7 major language families. Now, you can immediately discount this green Indo-European language family. All that means is that when Europeans came in and colonized, they replaced the local language with English or Dutch. You can also do kind of the same thing with this yellow and purple language group called Afro-Asiatic. Basically, that's just a fancy way of saying that they speak Arabic, which of course, Arabic was created over here in Arabia. It's not a African language. What's left then is sort of this reddish, pinkish, and also blue language that really would be truly African language. Nilo-Saharan is also a truly African language, but it's very related to Afro-Asiatic. The Bantu language there in the middle is actually sort of very closely related to the Niger. It's a subfamily of the Niger Congolese language group, and it was spread through much of southern Africa through a migration of a group of people called the Bantu that lasts several hundred years. The Bantu were farmers, and they used advanced tools and pottery for their time. And as they moved, they spread their technology and way of life with the local Southern Africans, who were speakers of that blue Khoisan language. And the Khoisan were mostly hunter-gatherers and sort of more tribal people. There are still Khoisan people in Africa, and the language is still spoken today, but they're a much smaller population, and they're even really kind of considered sort of indigenous tribal people, even by the Africans that live there today. Sort of similar to the way we would look at the Australian Aborigines or some early Native American groups. Sort of, they're sort of set aside and protected as a group of people. This Bantu migration takes place around 1000 BC, and it continues for hundreds of years at roughly the same time as the Persians and the Egyptians and the Romans and the Greeks. And so it's pretty clear that Africans are developing civilization roughly on pace with Europe and the Middle East. They're not behind in any way, shape, or form. It's just nobody knows about them because of the Sahara Desert. By the 700s CE, however, Muslim caliphs had extended their control over, most of North Africa, but were still no closer to conquering the Sahara Desert. Muslims were aware that there were sub-Saharan civilizations because they are sailing down the Red Sea and the east coast of Africa, trading with those groups. One of those groups was the Empire of Aksum, which we will discuss in a moment. But clearly, the Muslims recognize that there are opportunities just on the other side of the desert. It's not the end of the world. We just have to figure out how to get across it. So, to adapt crossing the Sahara, Muslims brought Bactrian camels, which are not native to Africa, from the east side of Iran and used them in these long camel caravans to slowly explore and create safe routes through the desert. What they found on the other side surprises them. So let's take a look at some of these major empires. Keep in mind, this is not a comprehensive list of civilizations or kingdoms. This is just a selection of some of the notable ones. I'm also tending to focus on earlier civilizations before Europeans show up, and that is on purpose. But first, I want to go back to the Aksum, right? Aksum was an ancient civilization starting around 100 CE until its collapse in 900 CE. And it was located mostly on the east coast of Africa in a prime piece of real estate where lots of people had to pass through on the Red Sea. Aksum traded with the Romans, later the Byzantines and the Arabs, and so they're a Sub-Saharan culture that was known by Europe and the rest of the world, but they were seen more as the edge of the Mediterranean world, more so than a sub-Saharan culture. The kingdom of Aksum had been so connected with the rest of the world that they actually were one of the first groups of people to adopt Christianity, like in the 400s or something AD, when it was really taking off. And in fact, this actually leads to its downfall. Aksum was hands down the center of African trade. But as Muslims came to dominate the region, they cut Aksum out of the trade because they refused to convert to Islam. They're Christians. One interesting note to share are these amazing churches at a place called Libella in Ethiopia. These churches are actually cut out of a single block of stone rather than bringing in materials and building it from the bottom up. So just kind of give you an idea of how they do that. What they would then have to do is cut down, basically quarry down this big square, and they would have to leave the stone structure here in the middle. So they would get to the bottom and they would just have this solid block of rock, keeping in mind that, like, that is the ground itself. That is no different than this right here. So once they got down there, then they would have to tunnel into the building. They would have to create the building and then tunnel up and hollow out the walls to create this church. This is actually one of the smaller ones. I'll leave a link in Canvas to show you 3D images of all of the other ones, and some of them are massive and just completely surprising that you could even do this. But it's just a very unique part of Aksum, and an excellent example of sort of the technological and organizational ability of Africans at this time period. So nonetheless, Aksum is a really important early link in African trade that is even before the camel caravans, right? Because the Muslims don't get there until here in just a little bit later. all the products from both West Africa and South Africa are sort of being taken over to Aksum. Those trade routes are developing and then sent out to the Middle East and India. But if you notice, all of our arrows here are pointing to sort of a blank part of the map. So let's take a look at West Africa and the important trading empires there. They have a couple, three of them that sort of build off of each other, replace each other as we go through time. And it starts with the Empire of Ghana, which doesn't look all that large, but it was a very successful trading empire. It lasts nearly 1,000 years in an extremely resource-rich, strategic spot of West Africa. Just north of Ghana are these extremely valuable salt deposits in a area that we call Taghaza. It was so plentiful, they actually would cut bricks of salt and they would construct their houses out of it. Just south of Ghana are extremely rich gold mines that people were eating. I mean, common people are eating off of gold plates. Women would use gold dust as makeup. That would just then be removed, right? So, I mean, how rich do you have to be to, use solid gold dust as something that you just wipe off and apply to the next day, right? Um, Ghana's success was acting as the middleman between them and controlling the resources that were exchanged around them. It's odd to think that salt could be a resource as valuable as gold, but it is really all about supply and demand. And salt was important for preserving food, and that made it intensely valuable. It was near the end of the Ghanaian Empire that Arab traders were starting to encounter West Africa, and they were glad to set up trade routes, right? Now, Ghana would eventually be conquered by a growing kingdom called on the border that bordered it, called Mali. Right, and Mali, its greatest ruler uh, was a fellow by the name of Mansa Musa. Right, he adopts Islam. One of the big pieces, or one of the most important pieces, is that he adopts Islam, and that makes Muslim traders extremely happy and more willing to come to his kingdom. It is interesting to sort of compare the experience of Mali with the experience of Aksum and see the difference between the choice to convert versus holding on to their historical beliefs. Aksum refused and was cut off and collapsed, while Mali flourished. Considering the wealth in gold that he controlled, history considers Mansa Musa as one of the wealthiest individuals in human history. Not just his time period, but literally all of human history. To display his wealth and commitment to Islam, we already know that Muslims make a commitment to take the Hajj, or a journey to Mecca, at least once in their life. On his Hajj, when he made his pilgrimage to Mecca, he brought along with him a procession that included 60,000 people, all wearing robes embroidered with thread that was made of gold, robes in Persian silk. He included 12,000 slaves who each carried gold bars with them all the way across the Sahara Desert. Um, he had heralds who were dressed in silk and who would call out ahead of him, here comes Mansa Musa, and they all held a gold walking staff. Musa would provide all of the food and necessities for this entire company of 60,000 people, including the animals. The animals that he brought along included 80 camels, which each carried 300 pounds of gold dust along with them. And Musa would give the gold away to the poor that he met along his route. He would not only give some of the gold to the cities that he passed along his way, but he would trade it for souvenirs, including like established, leading cities like Cairo and Medina, and he just kind of treated them like any other towns that he would come along. Oh, you need some of my gold. It was reported that he would build a mosque every Friday. He was also responsible after he returned. He was also responsible for building the city of Timbuktu, which contained a massive library and a mosque, and it became one of the world's most important centers of learning. And really, the name Timbuktu became synonymous with sort of a mysterious, um, uh, you know, very wealthy land, um, that was extremely far away. And so, if you have ever watched or read the Disney movie The Aristocats, at one point the butler sticks the cats in a trunk and says, "I'm going to send you to Timbuktu," right? Which was about as far away as you could possibly get, right? So even that word has sort of the name of that place has sort of entered into our cultural consciousness, right? Now, I want you to also keep in mind sort of this essential question and big idea, right? About was Africa uncivilized? And I think you have to look at it from the perspective of who's asking the question. Um, I think, like I said, the Africans would disagree, but Europeans take this approach like Africa is a place that needs to be tamed, or that the people there are savage, and I think a lot of that is, you have to keep into mind that most of the resources of Africa are not going to Europe. They're being funneled into the Arabic kingdoms. Europeans didn't have good relations with Muslims, so much of this wealth and knowledge of sub Saharan Africa, most of the interaction that you would get, is not moving to Europe. Europeans are not interacting with Europe. They're making suppositions based on their own cultural feelings, and it only makes European ignorance about this area worse. But trade is happening, and Africa is engaged with the world. Um, European kings want in on this wealth, but they think it's all coming from East Asia, in India. They're unwilling to trade with Muslims, and so what they wind up doing is developing their own ocean sailing vessels, and they start out on the great voyages of discovery. Part of that is sailing down around the African coast. So it's near the end of the Mali period that the Portuguese and Spanish explorers start bringing reports of Africa back to Europe and realizing that there are people down there and there are resources to be exploited, right? Now, I don't want to neglect developments in southern Africa, but while Mali was developing in the west, the Shona people in the south were establishing a trading empire and sending resources north as well. The name of this empire is traditionally called Zimbabwe, although the name describes the most famous ruins of the culture more so than the empire itself. Zimbabwe is the Shona word for large stone enclosures, and I use that term very specifically. Likely they were homes and buildings, but you'll see in just a moment we don't quite know exactly what they were. The largest of these is called the Great Zimbabwe, and you can see just how large these stone walls are. The Great Zimbabwe, it looks more like the walls, defensive walls of around a palace. It would be extremely difficult to think that they are putting a roof structure over top of all of that. And then inside of it is more stone walls. Um, and then on the outlying buildings or outlying Zimbabwe's, you can see, are those fences, or are they enclosures, defensive enclosures that then other structures would be on the inside of? We just don't really quite 100% know uh, what it was. But the amazing part of all of this is that the construction of these structures was completed using dry stacked stone. No mortar was used to kind of stick the stones together. So that means the rocks have had to be cut exactly to fit. And not only did they're still standing 1,000 years later, right? Um, it is truly the major trading empire in the South. And again, it sort of shows the level of organization needed to maintain trade. Um, these are moves that are made not by you know uncivilized or people that don't know what they're doing. Um, in fact, along the east coast of Africa, a language called Swahili is actually developed that blends native African Arabic and English words to make a unique way to communicate quickly and easily between cultures. So, last but not least, kind of back to West Africa, nothing lasts forever, and Mansa Musa's children and grandchildren were less capable rulers than he was. The Mali Empire would eventually be conquered by a militaristic empire that we call the Songhai. The Songhai would eventually create Africa's largest empire, but it doesn't last very long because now Europeans are in on the game, and it's going to strain the Songhai's ability to trade and meet the demand for resources. So you got to think that by the 1500s, Spain and Portugal had discovered America and were establishing plantations on many of those Caribbean islands. The native Caribs quickly died of diseases, and the Europeans need laborers to work the plantations. Just to kind of give you an idea, I don't want to make this too much about American history, but this is a really important moment in African, or rather in U.S. history, or a connection between U.S. and African history. This is where we will be picking up in the U.S. history series with the African slave trade and the Age of Discovery. The Songhai, however, are more than happy to participate in selling slaves to the Europeans directly. As such, they are always trying to expand into neighboring regions in order to meet the European demand for slaves. Ultimately, however, Europeans would, the more they interact with Africa, see Africa as a place to exploit resources rather than to simply get resources from the local native people, right? So by the early 1900s, nearly all of Africa was invaded and colonized by European nations. Their kingdoms were destroyed. The control over their own land was lost, and a new chapter of colonial or imperial Africa was underway. But that's for next week. What is clear is that up to that point, the rich resources of Africa, the population of Africa, the desire to make money made Africa anything but uncivilized. Africa demonstrates all of the characteristics of civilization. from political organization to complex social structures to monumental buildings. Certainly, the lack of written records does make it harder for historians to document African civilizations, and certainly African civilization doesn't look the same as European civilization. But it would be very hard to defend the position that later Europeans, or the Europeans that we'll talk about next week, will take, that Africa was a savage continent in need of taming and civilizing, and so that's why we should go in and conquer Africa. However, we will tackle that next week. Thanks for joining me on Cleo's Corner. See you on our next episode.